Hello Python here, welcome to your 7th video in your Python tutorial. Now, in the last video, we took a look at working with text data. In this tutorial, we are going to take a look at another type of data type in Python, which is sequence data types or sequence types. Now, what are sequence types in Python? So apart from representing data in numbers or in strings, there are moments when you want to record a collection of data sets. For instance, ages of students, grades of students, countries, cities, and then so on. And you want to gather this data in a form of collection rather than storing each value in a different variable. And that is where sequence types come in handy. There are 3 types of sequence data type that we'll be looking at. We'll take a look at list, we'll look at tuples, and then finally we'll look at range. Let's take a look at list sequence types. List sequence types are mutable. When we say they are mutable, basically it means you can change them, you can delete them, you can add to them. You can basically modify a list data type. And it's typically used to store collection of homogeneous items, meaning that it allows us to store data type which are similar in nature, as I've already talked about, ages, countries, and then so on. And that is where list dataset comes in handy. Let's quickly switch to our code and see how lists are represented. Mind you, this is not going to be a full list tutorial. We'll look at lists later on in the tutorials. We'll create a variable and we will call it ages to represent ages of students. To store a list, you will use square brackets. So once you create a square bracket and you assign it to, you assign a variable to it, Python knows that you are going to create a collection, or you are going to store a collection of data. I could say 12, 14, 17, 13, 15, 16, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then 13. So we have ages of 10 students, and we are storing this in a list. Doing this is very important, especially if you will be doing things like finding mean, finding median, finding the sum, modifying data. Let's just say within a few months, one student who was 14 turns to 15. Then you can access this particular age and then you will modify it. Or say a student drops out of the school, then you can remove his or her age and then so on. So this kind of data type is very, very useful when you need to store a collection of similar data types. So the ages, the lists come in handy. Just like other data types, you can find its type. So I can print its type. And then Python tells you it belongs to a list class. You can go on and do so many things. We would look at some of the operations that you can perform on a typical list, which is a mutable data type. So we mentioned mutable data. What is a mutable data type? We've already explained that a mutable data type is data set that you can modify. Okay, so it allows you to perform changes on them. And that's why a list is important when you want to store collection of data that you would be modifying from time to time. If you are storing information on temperature of cities, then with time these data will change. Okay, temperature at 30 degrees in the evening will likely fall to 20, 18, and then so on. And so you want to modify this data, and so that is where this it comes in handy. And the next sequential data type that we'll be looking at is tuple. Unlike a list, tuples are immutable, meaning that you cannot change, you cannot modify them. So it is best when you are dealing with data that doesn't change, and it's typically used to store heterogeneous data. So I talked about homogeneous data, which works for collection of data of similar form, whereas heterogeneous data stores data which can vary in its form, like I have shown here on the screen. Tuples are immutable, and because of that, you cannot perform modifications on them like you can do on a list. Let's switch over to our code and look at how a typical tuple data set would look like. I am going to keep the ages, but this time I am going to use a bracket, which is typically used for storing which is typically used for storing tuple data set. As I've explained, a tuple data set would not allow you to perform modification on them. Let's see an example in action. So what I'll try to do is to I'll try to use a property, or I'll try to access a list index. Now, accessing an index, it's a typical practice, a typical operation that you'll be doing on lists or on tuples, on sequential data types. I'll access the index of 1, which is 14. So counting in Python starts from 0. So the first item is 0 index, and the second item is 1, and then so on. I am assigning the second index with a new value, which is 17. And then I will try to print my ages tuple, and Python is quick to tell you that tuple object does not support item assignment. Okay, so that is what you should bear in mind. If your data will not change from time to time, then it's best to store it in tuple if it's going to remain constant. For instance, if you are storing data on capital cities of towns, or you are storing data on people's gender, you are storing data on people's blood type, these are things that do not change. One person's blood type would never change, and it's best storing this kind of data in tuples. Tuples also, like every other data type, would allow you to find its type. Okay, so I can find the type of my data. So I'll say print and then type function, and then I'll pass in my tuple, and let's see. So I run my data, and Python is telling me it belongs to class tuple. Great. Finally, let's look at range. Before that, let me make mention, I told that mutable data set like list allows you to perform several operations on them. So you can access the index, you can replace content, you can remove, you can append, you can copy, you can insert, you can delete, you can find a reverse, and then so on, which an immutable sequence data type like tuple will not allow you. The range type of data represents an immutable sequence of numbers and is commonly used for looping a specific number of times in for loops. So it's immutable, like I have mentioned, and it's commonly used when you are looping through specific number. So it has a very simple form. We'll switch over to our code and then see it in action. I can say for I We will talk about conditional statements. We'll talk about loops in a subsequent chapter, okay, but I'll just use it in an example. So for I in, and then we can say range, and here I'm going to specify the number of, I'm going to specify the end, okay, of my range. I can say 10, okay, and I will just say print I. Okay, so this is a very simple form showing you how range is applied, and then when I run my code, it's going to print from 0 to 9. So 0 to 9, it's up to 10. Okay, so counting 0 to 9 gives you 10 items. Okay, and it is looping. Now I didn't specify the stats. Okay, I could have just specified the start as well. So 0 and then 10, and then when I run, it's going to give me the same thing. So once you don't specify the end value, once you don't specify the start value, it assumes that you are starting from 0. So this is basically, a very simple, range in action. And when we move along, we realize that it has a lot of applications. Okay, so we'll be using them a lot in so many examples. List, we talk about tuples, and then we talk about range, which are all sequential data, and these have its own application. So for instance, list allows you to, list has a lot of usefulness or application when we get to another tutorial where we are talking about data science and where we are looking at mathematical computations. Okay, it will come in handy. So all that we are learning has its own applications, and we are going to get to them, and that is why Python is so useful. Guys, thank you for being part of this video, and I'll see you in the next video.